Yo, yo, yiggity, yo, what's going on, y'all? Welcome back to the Beast Mentality Podcast. I'm your host, Deshaun Beasley. I apologize for the camera angle, but the place where I usually put my laptop is kind of messy. But um, again, back with another episode talking about my YDev course. Shout out to the YDev department at Rhode Island College. The course is leadership, talking about leadership and nonprofits for this episode. Doing another journal entry, social movements and change in the nonprofit industrial complex. Um, and then before I get into the journal questions, just my initial thoughts was like, excuse my French, but what? Uh, Yo, I mean, we've been talking about it in class, just basically how like nonprofits, like what is a nonprofit? Nonprofits are the organizations that do the work that the state does not fund or that the state is unwilling to do. Uh, like for example, like how does it really benefit the government to improve the likelihood or the livelihood of people of color? It um, doesn't really help the government. But if they listen to Dr. John Hope Bryant, he's not a doctor, John Hope Bryant, he actually has a nonprofit called Operation Hope. I think billions of dollars, millions of dollars, I believe, that they make on an annual basis. But they actually are helping people, um, allegedly. I just have to say allegedly because I don't have any receipts of that. But but yeah, like they're helping people of color. And the reason why I brought him up is because he also talks about how because America is like the majority of the population is actually the minority. So like, and again, I don't have any exact numbers. I did not fact check this, but when he was talking about like more than 50% of the country are people of color, like Black, Latin, um, indigenous folk. So um, if over 50% of your population is struggling, um, how are you going to improve the country, right? If over half of your people are struggling, you're not helping that other half improve. But that's not why we're here. I mean, kind of it is. We're talking about nonprofits because nonprofits are the organizations that are instrumental in invoking that change in the lives of people of color. Um, how does the first question that we're going to respond to, and I'll most likely go off topic from these questions because I have so many thoughts that are on this topic, but how does this author describe the nonprofit industrial complex? Well, both of the authors, there's two articles. Is the name of these? One is The Revolution Will Not Be Funded by Andrea Smith. And the other one is Nonprofit Industrial Complex by Cedra Morgan Montoya, a Portland-based artist and writer. And both of the artists pretty much talk about how nonprofit industrial complex. It's here. I read the analogy, and then I'll kind of get nerdy on y'all. But the analogy that they says is it's like setting off to explore the wilderness of radical change, only to realize you're in a man-made hedge maze leading in one direction. Each bend of the maze is erected by a network of public and private entities, including the state, businesses, individuals, and nonprofits themselves, who make decisions that uphold the power each of them has in society. To build on that, and this is where I'll get nerdy, and not really nerdy, but really further explain it, is like the nonprofit industrial complex basically states that nonprofits, one, 2014 study found that 91% of foundation executives were white, 83% of the foundation executive staff were white, and 68% of the program officers were white. And that same study found that only 7% of foundation grant giving went towards nonprofits that explicitly serve people of color. So you have all these nonprofits who are supposed to be instrumental in helping the public, which, like I talked about before, more than 50% of the population are people of color. So you got all these nonprofits, hundreds of thousands of nonprofits, trillions of dollars, which is supposed to be given towards minority communities, minority people of color, BIPOC. I guess that's what I use, BIPOC communities. And in 2014, the study shows that only 7% of the grants that were given were towards nonprofits that explicitly serve the BIPOC population. Um, and then also in the first article, they even talked about the historical context about the grant giving. Let me find some actual. Okay, in 1916, the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations, also known as the Walsh Commission, filed a report on labor issues with Congress, warning that foundations were a grave menace because they concentrated wealth and power in the service of ideology, which supported the interests of of their capitalist benefactors. Meaning that the government or these foundations, these nonprofits, are in business to support and push the agendas of the wealthy. So you got the wealthy who have the power, who are donating to these nonprofits, and who's donating to the nonprofits. But they're only going to donate to the nonprofits who hold the same ideological beliefs. Now, we all know that in America, we do not believe the same thing. It took us hundreds of years to believe that Black people no longer were slaves, right? Like Black people were people. It took hundreds of years to even give women, white women, the power to vote, which is actually crazy, right? So, you got these wealthy individuals who are donating their money. What benefit do they get for donating their money? They get these tax benefits, and a lot of them start their own nonprofit. So that way, let's say I'm the millionaire, I got millions of dollars. I'm going to start a nonprofit, so that way I can relieve myself from some tax burdens that I may have, and I can put it into this nonprofit. And now I can use the funds from this nonprofit to push any agenda that I want. For example, and this is in the second article by the artist and writer. She talks about, let me find the direct quote. Uh, she was talking about how the gay movement that recently happened within the last like 10, 15 years or whatever. Um, and this is a quote. So why gay marriage? Because rich people wanted it. Ultimately, they drove the agenda of the movement with their donations. A lot of the nonprofits who were instrumental in pushing the agenda for gay marriage and gay LGBTQ plus IA rights. I think I got the acronym right. Like the people who were instrumental in that, like they were they shared the same ideology. The wealthy people shared the same ideology of that nonprofit, so they were willing to donate into that. Um, and to the point of the ideology, in 1938, there was an addition to the tax code that determined that any organization formed to disseminate controversial or partisan propaganda is not an educational organization and therefore not eligible for tax exempt status. Basically, if you don't believe what we believe, we're not going to allow you to be tax exempt. I'm talking 1938, right? So let's go into more of the historical context. But I think because I'm still explaining what is the nonprofit industrial complex. So that's one part of it. The wealthy people are only funding nonprofits who share the same ideology. That's the first part. The second part is the nonprofits are made up of individuals who don't even look like or even interested in serving the BIPOC community. Um, and then the third is the government is actually not allowing nonprofits, according to that addition to the tax code in 1938. They're not even allowing you to get tax exempt status if you don't, if you have an ideology that's going air quote against the state, right? So, in fourth, we can even talk about how, man, I took a lot of notes, so now I'm just trying to, oh, and basically, so because there's so many nonprofits and there's only so many benefactors, right? Like now these nonprofits are competing against each other for the funds, which means that if you are a nonprofit and you don't believe what these wealthy benefactors believe in, they're not willing to fund your nonprofit. And that's a part of the nonprofit industrial complex. If you don't believe what we believe, we're not going to fund you. Um, Plainly put. Dylan Rodriguez defines the nonprofit industrial complex as a set of symbiotic relationships that link political and financial technologies of the state and owning class control with surveillance over public political ideology, including and especially emergent progressive and leftist social movements. He and Ruth Wilson Gilmore argue that nonprofit industrial complex is a natural corollary to prison industrial complex. While the prison industrial complex overtly represses dissent, the nonprofit industrial complex manages and controls dissent by incorporating it into the state apparatus, functioning as a shadow state constituted by a network of institutions that do much of what the government agencies are supposed to do with tax monies in the areas of education and social service. Uh, the NPIC or nonprofit industrial complex functions as an alibi that allows governments to make war, expand punishments, and proliferate market economies under the veil of partnership between the public and private sectors, especially that last part, that veil of partnership between public and private sectors, because, and this is probably the fifth characteristic, I believe, if I'm keeping track, of the nonprofit and industrial complex is that the money that is being and the governments are also donate to nonprofits. So you got the wealthy benefactors, you got the government both putting money into the nonprofits. The governments, um, what happens is, and this was mainly through, was it Rockefeller? Was it Reagan? So we're looking at 60s, 70s, 80s, around that time frame. They're taking money out of these social services programs. And while they're taking money and resources out of that, they're actually donating money to nonprofits to do that same work. For example, I'll give you a very plain example. The government is supposed to fund trash cleanup. So the people who come every week to pick up your trash. Imagine that the government pulls funding from that, and then a nonprofit is created to collect your trash. So while the government is taking money and resources away from the trash collection companies, they're also donating money and giving grants to other companies to then collect the trash. Now, these are nonprofits, which means that typically they're underfunded, typically they're under resourced, they don't have the same capacity as the government has. So over time, what you see is there becomes a strain on these nonprofits because eventually, once those government grants, air quote, run out, now who's going to collect the trash? Because the nonprofit who was collecting the trash is no longer receiving the grants, and the government also pulled money out of the trash collection business. So who's picking up the trash? Now let's equate that to social services programs such as, healthcare and things like that. Like that's a part of the nonprofit industrial complex. Um, and then I think earlier I was talking about the competition aspect. So in order to evoke massive like social change, you need a mass movement. It's hard to create a mass movement when you got multiple people competing with one another for these grants just for survival. So we're all, myself, let's say you got three organizations who are all really instrumental in creating social change. One's for the youth, one is for women of color, and then one is for men of color. Instead of all three of these organizations working together to create a mass movement, they have the nonprofit industrial complex, I don't want to say forces them, but coerces them into believing that we need to compete for those funds because we all have competing agendas. And whoever's agenda aligns most with the government or the benefactor's agenda are going to receive those funds. So instead of banding together and creating a mass movement to invoke widespread change, now you're competing for the little funds that are available. Uh, I'm getting off track. I think that's probably like six characteristics. Should I go for 10? So that way I can title the video The 10 Characteristics of the Nonprofit Industrial Complex. Um, yeah, I think that's the main factors in that. What about the readings this week stood out to you? Right, one phrase. I mean, I quoted a few phrases from that. Um, why is the phrase relevant to you, and why did it stand out? I think a lot of the stuff for me is standing out because it's like giving giving people the illusion of hope and help. Like, oh, I'm a nonprofit, so we can apply for these grants, and that means that the government is actually like helping us with our mission. But in all actuality, the government really doesn't care about your mission, really. And they might just give you a grant for the short amount of time. They might give you the grant because actually it helps them with their political agenda. Also in the reading, they talked about how, who was it? I think I wrote this down. And I don't want to take up y'all time by going back into the reading. Bezos, around COVID time, he donated 100 million. He donated 100 million to like food insecurity, food shortage during COVID, while at the same time his company Amazon was actually laying off workers and firing people. So he was getting a lot of media backlash for that. But he's like, oh, let me put that money into some nonprofits. I believe it was Feeding Families and For America or something like that. I don't know the name of the nonprofit. He donated 100 million, and it sounds like a lot, but it's only a fraction of a percentage of his actual net worth and his wealth. So he's able to save face by just making a quick donation and make all those air quote bad things go bye bye. So I think that's the crazy thing, and it really hits home for me as somebody who's like looking to start a nonprofit because it's almost like how I think of it is like starting a nonprofit and being funded by the government through your nonprofit is almost like asking Massa for some help. Like, let me ask Massa for some help, and then if Massa wants to give us some help, he'll give us some help. But as soon as Massa don't want to help no more, like, we don't know what we're gonna do, right? It's like well, it was this was like one of the opening quotes of the second organization. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So if you want radical change, you're going to have to do it outside of the nonprofit sector. And that's not saying you can't have a nonprofit because that tax exempt status is wonderful, right? If, especially if you're doing good work and you don't want to have to pay taxes on all the revenue that you're gaining and all the donations that you're getting. And also the likelihood of you receiving grants and getting money from benefactors, um, it's just going to make it tougher because a lot of times it comes with strings attached, right? They'll give you the grant 1 year, but if your ideology doesn't align with theirs, you might not get that grant next year. And what's that going to do to your business, right? And then this gets into another conversation about like financial literacy with some of these nonprofits because again, like I think with increased financial literacy, I don't think the nonprofit industrial complex, I mean, I do think it's a problem. I don't know if it's the problem because if if nonprofits were stood in solidarity with one another, they could pimp the system, if I'm being honest. Imagine you got 10 nonprofits. Let's say, again, let's use that previous example. One is a youth organization for youth in color, one is a women's of color organization, one is a men's of color organization. They all have different agendas, air quote, but let's say they're all receiving grants. Why couldn't they just bring those funds together that they just got from the government and then begin creating massive change? And if you have the financial literacy and you're doing what some of these other rich, more profitable nonprofits are doing, you can invest those funds. So now you have your own bank. You're creating your own bank because you can live off the interest because you don't have to pay taxes on that money. So like now you're able to self fund, right? It's like getting a startup fund, right? You start up crowdfunding essentially, crowdsource, yeah, crowdfunding. Um, I mean, it's just a thought, easier said than done. Um, but yeah, it's just like, man, like all the good work that people who have nonprofits want to do is just being pimped out. Like they're being overworked. A lot of people, I mean, how it's seen as like, hey, you can start a nonprofit and this can be your life work. When in actuality, like, yeah, you're just being pimped. Anything else that's really relevant? I mean, I quoted a lot of things from the passage. I think another thing that really stands out to me is the amount of this is another thing that stood out. In the United States, foundations are legally required to give away 5% of their assets annually in order to ensure that they are active in charitable giving. Instead of investing the vast majority of their endowment in the stock market, a majority of their endowment in the stock market and growing assets without ever giving a substantial share to the to charities. So yeah, it's crazy. So imagine I'm wealthy, I'm a billionaire, and I put millions of dollars into this foundation, and this foundation can invest that money into the stock market. And let's say we have a 15% rate of return, I only have to get 5% away towards my cause, and I can keep 10%. Yo, you talking about playing the system? And that's what I'm saying. Like, it's not enough. And this is kind of my thing with the whole capitalist thing. Like, I think we need more black capitalists. We talk about Black Lives Matter, and I'm stealing this from John Hope Bryant. Shout out to him. Black capitalists matter, right? Like, if you teach more people to pimp the system, then we can use this for our benefit. Imagine if a bunch of wealthy black individuals were to start a foundation and you had somebody who was well versed in the financial industry to invest that money, and let's say they're getting a 15, 20% rate of return, you can have at least 5% of that go towards your charitable giving and whatever you want to do. And then you got that other 10% that you can reinvest into the market, or you can use that for operational expenses. Um, and then you just keep building your air quote portfolio from there. But that's all I got. Yeah, this nonprofit industrial complex definitely has me thinking about how I want to structure it and how I'm going to pimp the system. I know as soon as I put this on YouTube, who knows? I might get a knock on my door from the feds. Who knows? But I'm out of here. Peace.